Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. I have heard that the last session went right up to the minute, so I'm going to fill time here for 20 seconds while everybody files in. And also, thank you so much for joining us. This is our last roundtable of the conference. I hope you have a nice hot cup of coffee, or depending on where you are, your cocktail of choice on what is actually a very chilly Friday here in New York. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Candice Murray, VP of Editorial at Shutterstock and the Vice President of the Board of the DMLA. I am absolutely honored and thrilled to have the opportunity today to speak to two amazing women, Laura Mignot, CEO of DFlash, based in New York, and Leslie Wingo, President and CEO of Sanders Wingo, based in Austin, Texas. I'm going to start by turning it over to each of them to tell us a little bit about themselves, their career journey. And we always love to hear outside of work, what makes you tick and brings you joy and passion. Laura, I'll start with you. Thank you so much again for joining.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Happy Friday, almost happy hour for everyone. Um, I'm Laura Manossi of the experience agency DFlash. We've been around about 10 years, and we spent that time designing experiences that make people feel welcome. So over the last 9 years, we've done everything from rapid buses to do 5 activations at South of France with the Cannes Lions, to do private dinners, summits, you name it, event production. So it's nice to be on this side of the house, as I was saying earlier. But for us, everything we've ever designed has made people feel welcome when you walk through the doors and at home when they're in the experience. And that for us is the most important aspect of this. It's never been about like, oh, I have to make this super duper inclusive. It's just, if it's in your DNA from the very beginning, you can tell really evocative stories that everyone wants to be a part of. And we've been honored over the last 9 years to be able to do that for a number of brands that you've all heard of, like Netflix, Samsung, Amazon, Bose, all those great ones. And then outside of work for me, I also host the Reset podcast, which brings me tons and tons and tons and tons of joy. We got to talk to business leaders like the wonderful ladies here on I'm sharing the stage with today, as well as folks and entrepreneurs, founders, leaders, celebrities, you name it, have been on the show, and they talk about their career journey in honest and straightforward ways. And I think, as we're in this unique time of the pandemic, it's so key to hear from folks about how they're navigating, how they're managing, how they're navigating their self-care. And so for me, it's been an absolute joy to have that as a fun thing to do during this really weird and crazy time, and psyched to be here.
Weird and crazy is an understatement.
Of the decade. I know.
Leslie, how about you? Tell us about yourself.
Sure. So I run a company called Sanders Wingo. We've been around since 1958, and over the course of our 60 years, we've made a lot of pivots, and right now we're still making another pivot. But what's exciting for us is that we're an agency built in culture, and I spent the last 20 years of my career understanding African American consumers, looking at behavioral economics, and understanding why we crazy humans make just the strangest decisions ever. Most of them are irrational, but it's been a lot of fun, and especially in this moment of understanding human beings and why we do the things we do and how we do them. That really gets me excited and gets me moving during the day. But as a side hustle, one of the things that I'm committed to is creating a world where this equity and inclusion conversation is just normal. It's not a set aside, it's not a day of the month, it's just normal. And so I'm working right now with the LBJ Foundation to create conversations around what are some of the practical things people can do to be in action, especially as we talk about equity and inclusion for all. And it's not just about race. It's about how people show up and how they feel comfortable in their spaces to be who they are. So a little bit about me, a little bit about Sanders Wingo, and a little bit about my side hustle.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. And you both mentioned it, and we're here to talk a little bit about this wild and crazy year for so many different reasons, between the pandemic and social unrest, and it's an election year, my goodness, in just a few days. Tell us a little bit about how this has affected your business, your clients, the relationship you have with your clients, the work you're doing for them, if at all, this year. I'm sure it has. Leslie, I don't know if you...
Sure, I'd love to take it. So it's been an interesting year. So at the beginning of 2020, when we all thought the Australian fires were going to be the worst thing that could be happening, Sanders Wingo was in the process of making a couple of pivots. And as we started going down this journey in March, I remember being on a plane and everything changed. No more travel, no more work meetings. a big festival here in Austin was canceled. And so for our clients, some of our clients have really thrived in this environment. And unfortunately, some of them haven't been able to make it, especially when they are tourist clients, tourism based, experience based. And what we're realizing now with our clients, the ones that are coming to us, it's less about how do you communicate with consumers, but for Sanders Wingo, it's more about how do we talk about ourselves in this moment of racial justice? What does that look like internally? How do we talk about it on the internet? How do we talk about it? How do we clean up the own funk that we have within our companies before we can start talking about it to the exterior world? And what we're also seeing is this incredible ways that people are starting to tell their stories, and through the arts of everything. So the arts that I remember, there was a craze of sourdough and who can make the best sourdough. And we're going to put photos of that all over the internet. We're going to do our secret sauce and secret recipes. But now the stories are starting to shift. And as we figure out what this moment is, and loosely called normal, the new normal, whatever that might be, I think the storytelling aspect for humans and brands are becoming more and more apparent. And it's being done in these beautiful multi-channel kind of ways, and where we see these beautiful photos start to tell those stories and those complexity of stories, and just the layers of it has been amazing.
Absolutely. Laura, similar experiences these past?
Yeah, I mean, months? In January, we were an experience communications agency, and by April, we were a cultural communications agency, because the thing that we had launched in January was this new product called the Culture Boards, where we were going to help brands be smarter about culture by helping them figure out how to have a board of directors that was built from the best of every part of the industry you could think of. So age, race, gender, all senior leaders. So we were all psyched about that, launching that at South by, along with the big giant activation we're doing for a client, doing video and a live event for South by. And then I remember being at a restaurant waiting for the call, and then all of a sudden I hear post, oh, canceled, damn. And then millions of dollars just went out the window. But you know what I think, for us as a company, it gave us a unique opportunity to sort of get our creativity back. Because one of the things that has been a result of this is that we've always been fantastic storytellers from the experience side of the house, but this got us to kind of dig that deep and become the storytellers we always knew we could be. But since we're always traveling, we're always on planes, we're always building things, we didn't have a chance to do. And our clients especially as well, how do we tell new stories when I can't fly you somewhere? I have to bring that experience online. I have to tell that story through video, I have to tell that story through imagery. And it's been a phenomenal experience. And now we're back on track to have a really phenomenal year end. And I think it's because this uniqueness of the time, a pandemic, a racial pandemic, all as well as a highly contested election, all happening within 6 to 7 months, gave everyone an opportunity. Like, wait a minute, okay, how do I reinvent this? How do I tell more inclusive stories that are just stories? And getting back to the heart of the matter of how do I evoke storytelling through imagery in ways that doesn't feel like I'm trying too hard? And so that's been, I want to say the blessing of this all, getting back to the brass tacks of telling stories.
And let's talk about that for a second. So when we think about January versus today, people, the types of imagery people want to see to tell the stories has changed tremendously. Do you think that the way they respond to imagery also differs today versus January? And then what are they expecting to see? Do we know?
You want to go first, or I can go first? Rock, paper, scissors.
Go first. I'll go first. I'll go first. They want to see images that reflect the world around them. And I think, the one thing that's come out of this is a renewed honesty about this. Is you actually do want to see the interracial gay couple. You actually do want to see the families where not everyone is the same size. Like, if you look at what Peloton recently did, think about how Peloton originally last Christmas was the skinny white couple, and is she being held hostage when the husband buys her a Peloton, to now you've got plus size communities who are on Peloton who are starring in their commercials. Do I think that happens if we aren't all at home and now actually are paying more attention to fitness, but also the images that we see? Probably not. So it's a renewed honesty about this is who I am. I want to see that reflected. And if you do that, I'm going to buy your product. And if you don't, I'll find a brand who does.
Mhm.
And I think for us, what we were seeing is, I have this my favorite saying is, people hate two things: change and the way things are. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw a lot of, let's see imagery of the way things that used to be, right? Let's have these big gatherings, and this will be over in 6 weeks. And so what does that look and feel like? How does that bring people together in a socially distanced kind of way? And so we were telling all these stories in reverse, but now I think what we're looking for are photos that tell future, right? So very much in, what are people up to? We need to see people in the mass, because that is going to be how we live. How do we see people interacting in this crazy environment of COVID and racial justice? And I think part of what we want to see is hope, right? It's not, while it is a very trying time, I think there are some wonderful things that are coming out of this, in terms of how we connect, how we get creative, how we show up in the world, how we communicate with each other. I mean, this crazy idea that I'm talking to on a panel with two people in New York right now and having this great conversation, that just blows my mind. And I think for us, those are the images that we're looking for. How do we see ourselves, not only now, but how do we see ourselves in future?
Mhm. Absolutely. And Leslie, when we spoke, I don't know, a week or two ago, you used a term that kind of stuck with me, and you said you were working towards storytelling within culture. And I love that. So how are you helping your clients tell that story in today's culture? What are you doing differently than you did in the past, or that you've always done that is finally at the forefront and people are hearing or listening?
I love storytelling, and I especially love it when it's in culture, because culture is so interesting, and it just changes so much depending on where you are in the world. And it's more than just this culture of race and how you grew up. It's how all those beautiful layers come together like an onion. It's just so complex. And so what we've been doing is to try to understand these cultures through different ways. A lot of the conversations that we're having internally is about food and flavor profiles. And if you're in Texas, you might think hot as one way, but if you're in Northern California, that spicy flavor might be something else. But how do we look at all of these things and bring them together so they're uniquely our own? And I can use my husband and I as an example. I'm a Black kid from West Texas, from El Paso, Texas, which is primarily Hispanic. He's a Mexican kid from Dallas, Texas, that grew up in a Black neighborhood. And so for our wedding, I wanted mariachis, he wanted to jump the broom. We did both. And I think these are how these culture things come together. In my head, I want to start this chitlin and menudo circuit where we just talk about food and cocktails and things like that. But I think for us, it's all about, you got to talk to people to understand, not even understand, but have an understanding of culture, to be able to tell true stories of where people are in this crazy moment.
Mhm. How about you, Laura?
Yeah,
Working.
building off what Leslie said, it's about listening to other cultures. I think the problem has been we've been talking at people and just expecting them to be like, oh, isn't this awesome? As opposed to like, let me listen to you. And I think, one of the things we always make a joke at the agency is that we've never done diversity and inclusion. We just do stuff, parties that people want to come to all the time. And when we built the Cannes Lions last year, the Inkwell Beach experience, it has been the first time that we've ever done a diversity inclusion beach at Cannes. I'm like, no, I built the coolest beach ever, and I had 105 speakers who were highly diverse because I asked them to come. But I made an experience that made you feel welcome and you wanted to be a part of it. And I think that's the thing that has to happen now. You have to build things that people want to engage with because you're listening to them. And I think when you think about culture, it's not just race and gender. It's location, it is age, it is neurodiversity. 35% of Americans have some degree of neurodivergency. Like, we've got to remember that we are, as Leslie beautifully said, we're all onions. There are tons and tons of different layers of us all, and you have to embrace that. And when you're thinking about the stories that you tell, if you can fill up those stories with the beautiful complexities that we all have, that's when you get people to pay attention. If you think about the things that have gotten folks really amped up over the summer, whether it's charging into nostalgia with like the verses things on Instagram, or the Princess Bride reunions on Twitter, what do you notice? The people who are listening and watching are hella diverse in age, race, gender, location, because we're actually paying attention finally to folks, as opposed to just like pushing the messages out and hoping we kind of spray and pray. And I think that hopefully will continue to stay as we go through this, because this isn't ending for another year and a half. So
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. And as you start to put these stories together for your customers, and you're sourcing content or imagery or even footage to help tell those stories, are you finding that you're leaning more on agencies that license content, the stock agencies, some of the networks that do this on their own? Are you struggling at all with finding this new image that people are looking for from brands to tell their stories?
I think we're still looking for a lot of places to show more mass content.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think there is still probably some hesitancy because folks still want to think this will go away. And it's kind of like we have to accept when this started. It's not going away. We're going to be in mass for the foreseeable future. People are going to have to be distanced. Like, there isn't going to be a thing where you have 80,000 people in a stadium anytime soon.
Mm-hmm.
So the more that we can have that content that, has people interacting with in daily life. Look, we're in New York, and weirdly, New York is coming back because people are wearing masks, and you can walk into Times Square and you will see people in masks in Times Square. Like, it is a thing. I need photos of that. You will see gatherings that are in Central Park where people are wearing masks. Like, and the more that we can show that this wasn't just this weird capsule in time that never happened, but acknowledge and listen that it is, but here's how reflecting that, I think, comes in really handy for us going forward.
Yep. And I think one of the things you said when we spoke last week, Laura, was who is going to invest at this moment and realize this is here to stay for the foreseeable future? Who's going to invest in producing content that folks like you need to source to help your customers tell their stories, for sure. How about you, Leslie? Any experience with or struggles with trying to source content to help you?
So hopefully y'all can hear me. Yeah. So for us, there was this thing floating around. I think it was on Instagram, and it was this kid blowing out candles on a birthday cake. Well, in future, I don't see how that's going to be possible, where you will share a piece, this cake where everybody has spread. I have kids. My kids are gross. They would put cooties all over the cake. And so what are these new images and storytelling, and how are we going to live our lives? And is the story now going to be, instead of a birthday cake, it's now a cupcake, right? And so those are the images we're trying to find. Those are the stories we're trying to tell. But I think for us, we have these opportunities and we're looking for these things, and they don't necessarily exist. And so is there a way for us to co-create some of these things together? But to Laura's point, who's going to invest in this to make this happen? And I think it's also so interesting that in our neighborhood, before, I knew there were people that lived in these homes. I just never knew who they were. Now I know who all these people are, but I have not found anything that reflects my community. And so these are these evolution of things. I've moved my life from an airport to like in my home office. How do we start expressing and telling some of those stories in a real honest way? And that's where we're struggling a bit, because the stories, everything's moving so quickly. I mean, it never seems to stop.
Yep. Yep. Although one of the things we also talked about last week, and managing our editorial business at Shutterstock, I had said early on, we started to see more and more brands turn towards more editorial content, news content, especially, to help tell their story and, tell their consumer that we're with you through all of this, through thick and thin. And again, Leslie, you said something that just made me realize you're absolutely right. The sugar rush is over, right? For using that type of content to tell the story. It has shifted. It is shifting. It's there in terms of showing what's really happening and what's going to continue to happen for a long time. So as you're talking to, a group here of folks that are producing content and sourcing content from vast contributor networks, what advice would you have for them as, they pivot to accommodate folks like you and all of our customers?
So for me and for Sanders Wingo, I had this weird moment this morning where when I do presentations or keynotes, I don't present with a lot of words. I like to present with images. And so these images tell these complex stories as I'm telling my story. And so I want to thank this group for providing those images so I can tell other stories. But I think as we start to think about content and what that looks like, I think we've covered a lot of that in the conversation in terms of how do people really look and how do they really show up and what are they really doing? How do we find those images so they can enhance parts of the conversations that we're having? I also wonder, is there a way for us to also work together so when there are opportunities to create together that we can join forces, maybe everybody goes off to their corner and then we come back and we have this beautiful presentation for clients so we all make a little bit of money at the end, unapologetically so. But I think the 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 tragedy of this moment, because there are so many to be conscious of, I also think in this moment there's great opportunity for creative growth and creative ideas and creative sharing and just new ways of looking at the world. And from my experience, it's through images and the things that y'all see that we don't necessarily see, and that's why I love creative people that you can bring to the table.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Laura, what would your
Yeah,
be?
it's like, for one, please get the words politically correct out of your head, and think, or I have to be diverse. Let me throw in someone who is of color, I think. And instead look for the richer stories, not the same cliche. Because I think that's, this is the opportunity, because now we're all here. So the stories you brought, I'd have to go all the way to this one place to get this one shot of maybe this one particular DJ. No, I actually don't. I can actually grab that from, going to a social distance event and grabbing that photo of that really cool DJ that's up and coming in my local neighborhood. Like, tell the richness of these stories. Don't be afraid of that. I think the one thing that has been the biggest change is that, like, no longer do we thoroughly care about celebrity. Like, I don't need to have a Kardashian in my ad to make that go viral. I think we've now got an opportunity to tell much more unique stories that encapsulate different types of people. This is a really great time to talk about the disability community. Like, why are they not more featured in ads? Like, they buy stuff too. Like, talk to use this as an opportunity to get in front of audiences you wouldn't normally get. Because the one thing that's going to happen from an event perspective is that we're never going to go back to this is going to be a 50,000 person event and there's no virtual part. There's going to be some sort of virtual part because, of course, I'd like to get those people who are at home watching to pay for this thing too, even if it's a different price. So the same thing comes to the content. Now that I've been accustomed to getting this stuff on Zoom, on all these different platforms, I want to be reflected in that. I want to see richer stories. I want to see the same tired as an afterthought imagery that is just because you think you have to see, don't get yelled at on Twitter. But instead, how do I build really rich, really evocative stories from different communities? And that's going to be because those people are going to pay money for it. They're going forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I have one question on chat. I'm going to ask this and then I'm going to turn it over to our audience. But have you seen a move towards using more historical or archival materials? If so, what do you think is behind this and how can our industry provide you with better materials from the archive?
My opinion on that is that the archives are this desire for, let me do this differently. I think humans want to be comfortable, and I think we were comfortable with before because before was predictable. We knew snow was coming, we knew summer was coming, we knew school was ending, and we knew how all of the systems work. And I think after March, all of those, not all of them, but a majority of the systems were thrown out the door. Like, my kid is remote learning and maybe she should be in school. I don't know. I have no idea what I'm doing. Hopefully we'll figure it out. But all of the things that were predictable, things that made us comfortable, things that were in place, we would go on trips, we would go on vacation. All of that has changed. And so I think the archival and the historical is this feeling of comfort. And I think the discomfort of not knowing what's predictable or what's going to happen is where people are feeling that anxiety and that concern. And so I think the second part of your question is what materials can you give us or provide us with? And I think it's this idea of I think people want to belong and be okay. And so when we think about future, are there things where we can show where people can belong and be okay? If it's in a mask, if it's socially distanced, what is the normalcy of that? And I don't know if that exists in every environment. I don't know if it exists in restaurants or in playgrounds, but I think we need some of these images that show people living and I don't want to say being happy, but that I think that what I'm trying to say is Saturday Night Live gives us these rooms. Like they finally, like they decide, it felt like they decided like now it's okay to laugh. So now it's okay for us to live. So how can you show us images of us living, but not, it's not all tragic. It's just different. And I think different is of course uncomfortable.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah, it's very much the different and the uncomfortable, because I think that's where we are right now. This is weird. Like everyone acknowledged this is weird. And there isn't something where you can be like, oh, this is gonna go back. No, it's not. So yeah, comfort gives you like that warm and fuzzy nostalgia of home, and you feel like you want to be a part of that. But in the same token, what else can you do today that leads with empathy? Because I'll give you an example of what not to do. So most recently, Burger King this week got in a little bit of a dust up for their campaign, where basically you could, strive by a burnt out or closed down competitor, McDonald's or Wendy's, take a photo, and then with a little QR code, you could get a free Whopper. So it's stock imagery of closed, it was in black and white, and and people rightfully tore them apart about this. And their response was, we missed the mark. And I was like, no, you didn't miss the mark. You looked at the time that we're in and you decided to ignore it and go back to an old school joke where you dunk on your competitors, as opposed to saying, wait, if 30 million people out of jobs, those smaller communities, those jobs are people's full-time jobs they no longer have. We are in the middle of a pandemic. People can't just roll up to McDonald's anymore because like that might be socially distanced and they don't want to go there. And as a result of that, Burger King is sort of like struggling with how to respond to that. And that's one of the things where it's like you take the image of the old school nostalgia where you could like make a joke and it's okay. And realize that sometimes some jokes are not okay right at this particular moment. So when thinking about the imagery that you're going to be creating, remember, read the room. Lead with the degree of empathy that's going to be telling the story. If you're going to be telling the story of a protest, like we all know what the protest videos you're going to take. Like we all know, but could you take something different? Could you grab a photo of something that tells a different story that's happening within the protest that doesn't have the same people that you always lazily look for when you take these photographs? Will that be something that you do? Because I think that's the thing we want to try and tell right now. What are the different stories that we have, but remembering the time that we're in and leading with a degree of empathy when you tell those stories through imagery? I think that's how you win the day.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And now you've mentioned, Laura, 2 instances where a brand has gone a bit wrong, although you and I talked about Peloton. They've right set their path. I'm an addict, so I'll have to support the brand.
You're part of the cult. I get it.
Yeah, pathetic. But question for both of you. Talk about a brand that's done it right over the past few months. Is there one that comes to mind?
Oh boy.
Sorry, that's the hot seat question that I about.
Ben and Jerry's? But they've always been kind of on they've been, in and around the moment of social justice. I think they've been a really interesting and honest brand that didn't just, get here yesterday, but has been in the fight for a long time. And so it wasn't surprising that when they came up with new flavors, made the donations, and again, read the room, and saw where we were and made conscious decisions to make a meaningful and lasting impact versus putting up a black square, which is what a lot of companies did back in June, July, and are now back to being weird again. So I think for me, probably Ben and Jerry's are kind of the ones that I've been pretty impressed with what they've been able to do.
The 2 that stick out to me for different reasons, both interesting reasons. Nike came out with this really interesting campaign and bringing people together, and the edit on it was amazing. And they use video and still images. Whoever edited that thing has patience that I don't even know how to find. So I think they did a good job. The question becomes, that's their outward facing brand. I'm curious to know more about their inward facing brand. Mm-hmm. And speaking of inward facing brands, there's another brand that I'm fascinated with because they take risks. I don't know if they do it well, but they do take risk and they take it. I think this year the NBA did a damn good job coming to the table and supporting a movement in a way that was comfortable and felt right for their brand. And I say their brand as the NBA, but also for their players, because not everybody wanted to do the thing. Not everybody was in the bubble, but they did do a really interesting and effective job about talking about the moment in the moment.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
also making proper change within what they can actually do. And I think that's the big difference, because I think oftentimes what ends up happening is brands go, let me quickly find a nonprofit that's non-offensive and give them $1 million and then hope this all goes away. As opposed to taking the inward work and figuring out, okay, we're the NBA, what widgets do we have internally that we can use outwardly to actually help make meaningful, lasting change? Oh, we've got arenas. It's one of the biggest problems is people going to go to vote and not feel safe. Okay, we will open up our arenas. They're sitting empty right now, and let people go here and vote where it's going to be safe. We'll staff it, and people will actually be able to vote. And what does that mean? Like we've seen, like the lines for early voting have been out of sight all across the country. So it's really, the brands who are able to sort of look at this moment and say, okay, who are our customers? Who are our staff? How do we embrace both in a meaningful way and tell a story that will last a whole lot longer than 2020? And that's what, that's a thing I think has been really quite lovely to see on the NBA side, is that as opposed to say the NFL, which still can't get it right.
No.
They don't want to, because they really don't want to.
Yeah, they don't want to. That's funny. Okay, I have another one here from chat, and then we can open up, you can raise your hand and we can open up your mics too, but I'll read this one. Driven by different things, but the 60s were a time of division and cultural change. And you can go back to look at the ads in odds, the housewife versus the young people of all races on top of a mountaintop. Do you see the current shift reflecting the divisiveness or mourning toward a real change to reflect the world around us? And are you bringing your clients along, or are they demanding change?
I think, for us, yes, there's a lot, we're creative people, so we dig into these things all the time, and some of us agree and some of us disagree. And then, in these same conversations, our HR guy is just freaking out about the conversations that we're having. But I think for us, it's important to have, so we can have
Absolutely
a POV going into a client conversation, because some of the clients that we work with and some of the groups that we're working with do have these conversations reflect some of the work they're doing. So we did a little bit of work with the US Census, and so we had to talk about these things and look back on the way things were, and then look back on how do we engage with people differently where they are. And some of that was showing up in places where people didn't have running water and being able to speak Spanish. And sometimes that was showing up to a food drive and just having different conversations. So yeah, when I look back on the 60s and, the things that my parents were dealing with, and looking now to what I'm growing up in also with my kids, there are some things that are definitely different, but I feel like there's some things that do remain the same. And some of the trends, I think in some places we're trending in the right way, and then some places, especially when it comes to women and money, we're trending in the wrong direction. So how do we impact those things and talk about those conversations in a real way with clients, and while we're pitching work? I think that's important, because I think I want to see positive change, and in my view, that is positive. How do we bring more people along? How do we talk about these things? How do we be in action? How do we see the future with all of us there, not just a select few? It's important for me.
Yep, absolutely. How about you, Laura?
Yeah, it's very much, having those honest conversations and being that ear for your client is sort of the first thing. And I think we've always established ourselves as always sort of being like the available agency, and team where our clients can ask those kind of tough questions and not get the weird look on our faces, even if internally I'm like, what? Outwardly, oh, great, Jen, tell me more. But more about the fact that, like, I think this thing I said early on, in our DNA has always been to be inclusive. And I think sometimes from a fear, here we're inclusive, and it means everybody but white men. I'm like, no, most of our clients are white men. So there's that. And we're not a multicultural shop. So it's like we're getting the work that they want us to do because they know that we do great work. But more importantly, that they can have those honest conversations, and we can put them in rooms with folks where they can have these honest conversations, because that's the only way things change. But also, when there's been a lot of connection between 1968 and what's happening right now because of the controversy with that election and everything, and all of the 60s upheaval that was happening that year and what's happening right now. But the same things still remain the same. It's a struggle for equality across a lot of different groups, and it's not just one. But if we could all work together in this sort of transformative realism about what we can do, we can help each other. So you think about this, like when there's a cutout on the side of the sidewalk, that was for people who were disabled, who were in wheelchairs. But what does that also help? Moms who've got scooters, who've got strollers. You've got people who might have trouble walking and they're using that for canes. Like when you make those changes, it helps everybody. And so the same thing happens within those storytelling. When you talk about everybody else and you bring those other images in, everybody else feels included as well. It doesn't feel like, oh, well, it's just for me, but oh, actually, that is so fantastic that they're doing that. I'm paying more attention to this. And so I think as we continue to go along, it's listening, it's having this empathy, it's also giving your clients some space to have those conversations with you. And if you don't feel comfortable being the person to have the conversation, hiring the people who are. And I think, that's what I'm saying. Like this ability to collaborate with everybody else is so much more accessible now than ever before. Like now, Leslie and I are in, New York versus Texas. Like how else would we have met unless I met her during South by having a cocktail somewhere at Guero's. But that's the thing. It's like, we all have this opportunity now to really collaborate in ways we never thought possible. And so that's for the good of this. And like the hope is that if we take the good from this very difficult situation, we won't have to go back and worry about going back, because we're just going to be moving forward one step in front of the other. It's not going to be easy at all. But I think if we do it together and we listen, we can get there to a much better place.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can I add one thing to that?
Please.
So as you were talking, I was thinking about this client interaction that I was having in culture and all these things. And it was around Black hair and about Black women and their hair. And I think one of the things that has been most amazing is to see this transformation of when my mom was in the 60s and she would press her hair in hot combs. And anybody who's done that knows that experience. To now where women can show me with my, naturally curly hair as we walk. And so I think those are some of the, the little things that when you create images and you start putting those layers in there where we can see people and see him as they are. And it's just little, it may seem little like hair, but for a lot of us, I'm like, this was a big deal. I remember when I was growing up and we see these women with this long hair, dyeing hair. I'm like, I want my hair to be like that, but it would never do that. And now I'm seeing women show up in these big, beautiful Erykah Badu and all these things. I'm like, I'm part of this thing that we're building. And I think that's where it gets exciting. And I think there's little tiny things that we can also see reflected in these images as we move through culture through the 60s to where we are now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think we have a question from Joe Naylor. Joe, are you out there?
I am out here. Thank you. And Laura and Leslie, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. This has been awesome. I have a question, and that is kind of how you approach what you do, because this year's been unbelievably challenging for all the obvious reasons. You both sound like you've really gotten your footing now, and you know which way you want to go to move forward. So I'm curious, what do you do to prepare for what could happen when you have such a major event like the election next week? And, depending on the outcome, this country can go in two very different directions. So how do you respond to that? Do you just keep marching forward and saying, this is the type of messaging we want to push forth? Are you having to be more reactive depending on what happens? And that might actually fundamentally change how you go about it. I'm just curious how you, respond to something that could go in one of two very, very different directions.
I appreciate that.
Why do you pick me first? Okay, here's what you do. Pray. Step one. No, but in all seriousness, look, yes, it could go in any direction in the next 4 or 5 days. I think just like how we didn't know what would happen on March, say, 7th, who we were on March 7th is very different from who we were on March 8th. I think that's when South by got canceled. And we figured it out and we adapted and we grow. I think, that's a thing that we have to sort of be mindful. It's like, it goes back to listening, to all groups. And no matter what happens, we have to listen. We have to have empathy, and we have to, pay attention to what's happening all around us. Now, yes, obviously things will get weird, depending on how the election hands out. But either way, we're still gonna be a country moving forward. We're just like, we've opened up Pandora's box. So we're not gonna be able to shut that down. But how we adapt is by, taking good care, listening to the folks listening to what our clients needs are, but listening to people around us, because one side will be super happy, one side will not be super happy, but those folks are still going to be customers. And how do you tell their stories? And that's by listening. So just after when we had the election in 2016, and there was all the protests that came after that, brands figured out ways to respond to their core customers, speak to them in a way that was with empathy, and added more. And so the same thing has to happen going forward. I think is that listen, know who your customers are, and tell the stories that matter to them.
And I agree. The listening is the most important and also the hardest part of what we do, because that's where I think the secret sauce is. And I think when I listen to customers now, more specifically consumers, this thing that we call cancel culture is real. And I think people are using their wallets more as a place of power as opposed to anything else. So when we have choices when we purchase things, and I can see more of that now on Twitter than ever before, where brands are being held accountable by consumers. In a weird twist, about 2 weeks ago, an agency in Texas, their founder said something that didn't sit well, and their customers, this agency's clients, ended up firing the agency because of what was said. And it's a very unfortunate turn of events, but I think what to get out of this is brands are holding each other accountable as are human beings. And so there's a lot going on between now and who knows, Tuesday, 2 weeks after Tuesday, whenever all the election results are counted. But I am hopeful for the future, because we are holding each other to a higher accountability than average, especially when it comes to consumers and behavior.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess there's got to be a little bit of a therapist element to it too,
Yeah. Oh, of course. If you own an agency that's a smaller agency, you end up becoming your client's therapist. There's a reason they have your phone number to text you at 11 o'clock at night. But it's also, trusted consultant who understands the universe around them. Yeah. Is the other way of saying it.
Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
Great question.
Leslie Hughes has raised her hand. There she is.
Hi guys, I'm kind of on the same vein, but we have such a divided country. And so you have these pockets that believe very different things. And you're trying to create, in many cases, I'm assuming, a nationwide or global brand and brand messaging. How do you kind of cross that divide for a company that wants to appeal to a broad audience, and yet these divisions are so deep and becoming, and again, quite divided? So that's one question. And then just a second part of it would be, visually, does that play into your decisions of what images you use where and how?
So for us, the imagery always plays into what we're doing, because it's key in telling stories. I think for the brands that we're working with and the clients that we're pitching, I think a couple of things. One is going to be off-putting, and then the other one is, they are what they are. When we work with brands, it's about bottom line. And when we talk about the changing landscape of America for some of these clients, the Gen Z and millennials, they are multicultural. And when I talk to CEOs, it's like, this is the reality of what's happening. And I get people hate change in the way things are, but be prepared for the change, because we all understand return on investment and green and dollars at the end of the day and quarterly earnings reports and all the things. And so if the intention is to be the best that you can be and make money, then we're going to have some honest conversations. Sometimes those conversations are easier than others, but it's if we don't have them, then brands don't remain relevant. And if they're not relevant, they don't stay in business. And I think as we go through COVID and we are more particular about where we're spending our dollars, I think these two things come in play more and more than ever before.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree 100% with Leslie. This is about market expansion. And I always say, I'm a capitalist, just like you are, Brand X. And the idea is, how do I get the most people to love your brand? And when you have a plethora of choice. And so you, like I said earlier, remove the words PC out of your brain. Like that can no longer be the conversation. The country is getting younger and browner and more fluid than ever before. And we're not going to revert back to where we were even say 15 years ago. And the brands that are listening to their customers and seeing the opportunity for new market expansion, because if you think of it this way, who else could I actually get to talk about my brand, to try my brand out, and to love my brand if they only knew about it? So how do I connect with those audiences? And that's why you're hiring companies like Leslie's and my own, because we can help you get there. So it's not going to be an easy thing where you just smack an image of a Black person or someone who's in a wheelchair in an ad, and then that suddenly solves your problem. It's what are you telling? How are you engaging? What are you doing? What are you putting your dollars? So that those stories are evocative to those such audiences. And that's going to be the art and the science behind it all. And the hope is once you do that, those audiences respond. But you have to actually pay attention to the world around it and definitely read the room that we're in right now.
Laura, Leslie, it was so wonderful to do this with you. Thank you so much for giving us your time on a Friday afternoon. This was a great conversation, one that should just continue and go on and on and on as this world continues to do what it's doing. Thank you both very much. I do want to take a minute to thank our sponsors. This is our last roundtable of the conference: Capture, Image Rights, Pick Rights, StockTrack, SmartFrame, CDAS, and especially Google. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful weekend.